deep dive discussion on the future of iGaming in Ontario. Moderated by Michael D. Lipton, Dickinson Wright. With Yaniv Spielberg, Bragg Gaming, Harvard Len, Nordic Affiliates, Jonathan Doubilet, Playtech, and Aaron Speach, Esports Technologies.
Good afternoon. How are you? My name is Michael Lipton. I'm with the law firm of Dickinson Wright, and I am the moderator in relation to this very interesting panel during these extremely interesting times relating to a deep dive into the future of iGaming of Ontario. You notice I had a look at the script because it's a little difficult to think after 16 years we have finally broken through in this country, and we have finally found a regulator and a province that is fully supportive of regulated iGaming. So I think that that's absolutely fantastic, and I'm still floating up there trying to appreciate how wonderful that is. But with the advent of regulated iGaming in Ontario, one may say that Ontario has entered into a brave new world. And this is a bold step for any government to take, and many observers are watching and waiting to see how the market will roll out. Both operators and suppliers have made considerable financial and other investments to qualify as an iGaming Ontario registrant. And viewed in this context, it's essential to be aware of how the market will develop, what issues will arise, always asking, what is the future of iGaming in Ontario? We know that the market is very competitive and will become even more so, and consists of operators from the United States and Europe, as well as domestic operators. Additionally, one must recognize that Canada has a very strong market for iGaming and has been the case for several years, operating as many would classify it as a gray zone or a gray market. Indeed, many Ontario registrants are still offering their iGaming services to the rest of Canada, largely because of the tolerance shown by law enforcement authorities to offshore operators. And with these factors in mind, let's start off by asking each particular panelist. First of all, and let me start with Yaniv, what are your views about the future of iGaming in Ontario, and what will it take to be a winner in this market, recognizing that it's growing every day? We learned last night that a new operator was added, and there's many more in the channel. Yaniv, any comments, suggestions, views?
Can everyone hear me? I think that, look, I grew up in Toronto and Ontario.
I don't think that they can hear you.
Can they?
Everybody hear him?
Okay.
People in the back, can you hear him? Okay.
All right.
Over to
Good.
you.
Thanks, Michael. Look, I grew up in Toronto, and I feel like people in Ontario have been betting forever. I think it was about time that that legislation had passed. So we have a regime for online gambling in Ontario, and the AGCO and iGaming Ontario have done, in my view, a really good job in finally legalizing it. I think that the future is really bright because I feel like gambling has been a part of sports and part of iGaming for quite some time. So it's not something that needs to be taught to the people in the province. It's something that has been going on for quite some time with great operations. I think that the future is going to be going in the right direction once there is some element of enforcement. I know that we're just 2 months after the go live date, but it's about licensing and it's about enforcement to make the market as competitive, but also as safe and secure for the people who are actually betting, and for the operators that have taken the time and of course that paid the dues to get the licensing. It is important that there is an element of enforcement, because otherwise I think that the gray operators are going to be continuing doing what they have been doing forever without any due course to what the licensed operators have been doing.
Great. Jonathan, what are your views?
I mean, I draw parallels between Ontario and Europe, actually.
Okay.
I primarily focus a lot of my time on the US, and I just can't draw that same parallel because it's been a black market for so long. And what we're looking at here is a gray market, which became a white market. And that's very distinct. There's been operators who've been here for years now, working gray, all right? I'm not going to say legally or illegally. And all of a sudden they have to volunteer for some sort of scheme that legitimizes them. And that's something that we've seen play over and over in Europe. In some examples, in some countries, it's been done in a good way, in an efficient way. And in some examples, it's been quite poor. And what we're seeing now, I think, is actually I've got to give credit, as Yaniv was saying, to the AGCO and the IGO, something that was really well done. I think we're around 18 operators almost.
Indeed. Yeah. There's 18 operators and a number of websites associated with them. So it's growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, we just went live with a company who many people might know. I used to get it delivered at my doorstep at the Toronto Star in North Star Gaming. And that's just an example. What you see in, for example, Europe or let's say the United States, where it's mainly you got your big three, right? FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM, and others to an extent. Here we're going to see something different play out because you've had endemic presence of companies like The Score and Torstar to an extent as well, dipping their fingers into this. And so it's a different dynamic that's playing out here. Really excited to see how it plays out.
Aaron, from your perspective, what's it going to take to be a winner in this iGaming market in Ontario?
Yeah, to kind of echo the same sentiments, it's very much like Europe. Enforcement's going to be key. So it is the early stages still, but if Ontario can enforce the actual legalization, then that's going to allow the operators to actually stay competitive here. If they don't, it's going to create issues with gray market operators having higher margins, ability to price things cheaper, which creates issues. Germany is a market where they haven't fully clamped down on the gray market yet. I hope they are more like some place like the Netherlands, which is very strict with the regulation.
What does the Ontario regulator need to do to make the Ontario market successful, especially from the enforcement perspective, acknowledging that Ontario is a very rich market and very attractive to offshore operator? So, Yaniv, let's start with you. What does the Ontario regulator have to do, from your point of view?
I think Aaron brought a really good point, and from my perspective, from a Bragg perspective, we were very strong with operations in Germany and the Dutch market, and so we kind of saw what plays out when you do it right and when you do it wrong. Not that I'm criticizing the regulators in these countries, but the German market, as Aaron mentioned, legalized or attempted to legalize iGaming and sport betting last year in July. They haven't issued any licenses yet, and it's been almost 12 months. They haven't done any enforcement. And so the black market, they have imposed a very high tax rate. And so the black market has been the winner of this legalization in Germany because there's no enforcement and there's no licensing. If you contrast that with what the Dutch government had done, they legalized sport betting and iGaming in October, and on the first day, they issued fines to anyone who operated not within the scheme, and suddenly every operator left the market, leaving it to only licensed operators, and you can see a fully white legalized market in the Dutch market.
Is that what you think is necessary?
Actually, this came up in our pre-panel discussion, and the Dutch market is a great example of how it went from a gray market to a white market, again, basically with enough preparation and heads up to all the operators. But anybody who didn't comply was shut off the next day. I think they did a really good job in enforcing it. You're asking me, what does Ontario have to do to make sure that this is a success here? To be honest with you, I think they've done it right. I don't think, there are certain unaddressed issues. I think poker is something we can probably touch upon that has to be tended to. But in terms of enforcement, they've handed out fines since almost day one. That's enforcement enough. I just heard from a panel at the CGS, and sorry to promote a competing conference, but that the regulator is basically warning that if operators continue with aggressive marketing tactics and testing the boundaries, they're going to get their wrist slapped, and it could be more than a wrist slap going forward. But I think
that again. They're going to what? Repeat that?
I think that there's going to be more than a wrist slap going forward
Right.
if they keep testing the boundaries of whatever the regulator or the AGCO is dictating.
Okay.
So yeah, you can quote me on that. I wouldn't test them too far. I think it's a very competitive marketplace. I think my mind's been blown by the amount of promotions I've seen thus far. But at the same time, if you go south of the border, you're going to see bonuses left and right, and you're going to be, drowned by the promos. Here, it's the same thing, but with less promotional offers. But again, I think they've done a really good job.
Let's switch on to another area. Aaron, can operators and B2Bs that are licensed in Ontario still operate and make their platforms available in other Canadian provinces? And if so, will this anomaly have any bearing on the future of iGaming in Ontario?
I'm actually not too sure. I work on the B2C side.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how the cross on B2B works through mainland
Yeah,
Canada.
look, I can
Yaniv,
help with that. I think we've spoken to the AGCO about this, and the view, I think, is that AGCO and IGO obviously care about Ontario. And so there are operators that are operating outside of the province on B2B platforms that are not licensed in the provinces, obviously, because there's no privatized iGaming and sport betting. So from the AGCO's perspective, I think that their most important and the way that they focus on is the Ontario market, which kind of makes sense, but I think it is a challenge. If you look south of the border, no one would dare to be licensed in New Jersey and operate in Pennsylvania without a license, because the New Jersey legislator, or at least the enforcement, will come down on your license, whereas in Canada, the AGCO has not been as strict about operations in other provinces without a license.
Yeah, I mean, from the B2C side,
Please.
specifically, we're able to operate in the rest of Canada, and then once our license is issued, we are then able to operate in both Ontario and the rest of Canada. The rest of the Canada using either Curacao or a Malta license. In the rest of Canada, you can either use a Curacao or Malta license, Gibraltar.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you say that. Just a little bit background. Clearly, the Criminal Code of Canada stipulates that in relation to internet gaming operations, and there are specific provisions about that in the Criminal Code, that belongs to the monopoly which is reflected by the provincial lottery corporations throughout Canada. That does not prohibit, however, operators from assisting in relation to the conduct and management that is carried out by the provincial governments. So on the one hand, you have the provincial government, and in this case in Ontario, it's IGO, but you can have a number of operators operate pursuant to the operating mind of IGO. That's the model, that's the law across Canada. And as a result, you have monopolies in British Columbia and Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, following that particular model. If anybody starts up an iGaming server in Canada and seeks to compete against a lottery corporation, there is precedent in Canada for prosecution of that entity that is based in Canada. Goes back to, I think, the early 2001. There was a company called StarNet that was prosecuted and ultimately pled guilty. There was another company in Montreal called CyberWorld that was prosecuted and ultimately pled guilty as well. The question is, what if you have your servers offshore? Are you within the jurisdiction of the criminal code? Can you be subject to prosecution? There has never been a case to that effect. So the question is, why do we have this tolerance in relation to the enforcement of the criminal code? And I think the issue comes down to maybe Canada is a more tolerant country than the United States. Maybe we've got bigger issues to be concerned about, like drugs and terrorism and things of that nature. But sooner or later, things are going to change. And so while today you may be able to carry on in other provinces using a Malta license or a Curacao license, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're carrying on legally. You're still in that so-called never-never market, and it's based upon whether or not the law enforcement authorities want to seek enforcement of the laws against you. The question is, does the criminal code have jurisdiction in relation to the offense? A second question is, does the criminal code have jurisdiction over the offender? Because if you're not in Canada, it's very difficult to prosecute. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to prosecute. So the upshot is, the information that I convey to my clients is, if you want to carry on in the rest of Canada, okay, make sure that you comply with the laws of Ontario, get licensed, or if you don't want to be licensed in Ontario, close out Ontario, do it in the rest of Canada. But remember, there is a risk, and that risk can change on a dime. Whether it will tomorrow or next year, we don't know. So far, it hasn't happened. You would expect that perhaps there would be escalating steps that would occur in relation to whether it's going to be enforceable. Perhaps a warning letter, maybe a slap on the wrist, maybe a name and shame campaign before anything develops into a prosecution. But these are so-called uncharted waters, and as Yaniv had indicated, this is not the United States, that's for sure. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, first of all, I can say that, Michael, you're stealing our thunder here. You should be you should be managing this on your own.
I'm just
but no,
trying to create a little bit of rain clouds for you, so that you can.
You know, though you're the perfect moderator for this panel, and I appreciate your input. I think what's very different, people are talking about how the United States is a patchwork of different laws and jurisdictions, and that every state is so different from one another. But Canada is actually even more so when I look at it. You've got Ontario with the type of enforcement that it's brought into place with the AGCO and the IGO. But you look at the other provinces, some are looking at tethering models, some are looking at tribal-led models.
Right.
And yes, that is playing out in the U.S., but in a far more consistent manner. You either really have, you have tethering models in almost every state, right? With the exception of a few. And those few are allowing, unfettered, access to the online market. Whereas here, the way it's playing out is you've got Ontario, you've got Quebec, who basically isn't showing any signs of moving to the regulated market, or at least not giving up the monopoly on a lot of Quebec.
Right.
Then you've got places like Saskatchewan, which are, looking to the tribes to manage the affairs of the gaming in the province.
It's now partnered with the BCLC.
Correct. So, I mean, people keep talking about the U.S. being a fragmented and difficult ecosystem to navigate. I think that Canada is actually more so. And as you pointed out, you've got to be very careful and verge on the side of caution. You don't want to be on the wrong side of the stick, so to say, when actually things get regulated in these various provinces.
Aaron, Yaniv, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the risk when you're a gray market operator, is that on a switch, they can either regulate or just turn off the ability for you to operate. So you always have to, de-risk your business by diversifying your gray market regions, not just in Canada, but obviously the rest of the world as well. And then when they do decide to go regulated, do your best to comply with all the regulations, get licensed properly. Likely most of the time you have to shut down your business for a time while you're getting regulated. But at the end, it's worth it to start your operations back up again in a, with less competition in the end, because it's hard to get regulated and a lot of companies don't want to do it.
Yaniv?
Look, we take a regulated first approach in our business, and we work only in regulated markets. And we were on the wrong side of history when Germany changed their laws, because we were a big operator in the German market, and then suddenly the legislation had changed. There was no licensing that was being granted and no enforcement, and so we kind of lost on that business. But I think we learned from that it's better to go with times and work in regulated markets like the Canadian market now, like the US market, and other European markets, because like you said, and I think Jonathan pointed out, you don't want to be on the wrong side of the stick when the stick comes down.
The point arising from what these gentlemen have indicated is that it is important that you're on the right side. But at some point in time in your past or in your present, indeed maybe your future, you may still be in a so-called unregulated market that may in fact be a black market. You may only have a risk analysis that says the risks are low of prosecution, not a legal opinion that says that what you're doing is legal. The facet about that is there is no bad actor provision in Ontario that would prohibit you from applying and qualifying in Ontario, assuming that you've come from that market. And if Ontario has determined not to have a no bad actor provision, I think that there's a very strong likelihood when and if the rest of Canada gets on side, and I say on side, that there will be no bad actor provision. So you may be able to say, yes, I will continue in this market. That may be somewhat gray, as long as the risks are acceptable, and recognize that that may not disqualify me when the market turns into a regulated market. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left, so let me just focus on this last question. We have a brave new world in Ontario, and my question to all of you is, will its success be dependent upon whether the other provinces adopt a similar model as Ontario? And I'm looking at it from the perspective of sharing liquidity in respect to, say, super jackpots or poker or esports. So is the Ontario market going to be dependent on whether the rest of Canada adopts a similar model?
In my view, and based on the discussion we had today with everybody, I think the answer is no. Ontario is Ontario. The AGCO and iGaming Ontario only care about Ontario, which is good and bad, but it's good for the province of Ontario. I think the success of Ontario will depend on the success of the people of Ontario and the province of Ontario alone. I understand that there's other bigger aspects when it comes to lottery and super jackpots and poker, but when it comes to iGaming and sport betting, it doesn't really matter. As long as it's regulated and regulated well and enforced well, then the actors that are in the province and are getting their licenses and are following the guidelines, they should have no problem winning in the province.
Jonathan, you agree, disagree, any comments?
I completely agree. I do believe that there is supplemental income to be generated in the form of tax revenue when it comes to liquidity sharing in such products and verticals like poker. As we know, and if you look, again, I'll compare it to south of the border, but you've got a fragmented society or ecosystem for poker to take place. You've got about 5 states that allow for it.
Yeah.
Certain states have liquidity sharing provisions and certain states don't. What we see in Ontario right now is the opportunity to have a white legal poker site, but is that conducive to a competitive offering? Do you want a small Ontario only ring-fenced poker offering? Do you want a Canada-wide poker offering like is still being offered right now in the so-called gray market? You mentioned those that, there's no bad actor clause and people coming and getting licensed now. I'm excited to see how the whole poker scenario plays out. And don't get me wrong, I mean, poker represents probably about less than 1% of all of the online gaming activity in the US right now, the regulated online gaming activity, but I believe it represents a far greater portion of the unregulated online gaming activity. So I think iGaming, sports betting, sure. I think we're on the right path in Ontario. It's not going to be dictated by other provinces, but such segments such as poker are still yet to see themselves play out, and I'm excited to see what happens and what transpires down the line.
Aaron, your views?
Well, yeah, with iGaming and sports, I don't think it really makes that big of a difference.
Right.
I mean, if you look at Europe, they do it, country by country. Canada's decided to leave it up to the provinces themselves to dictate the rules, so it's more of a U.S. model in that way. For products that are like pari-mutuel products, horse racing, super jackpots, anything where you need a larger group creates a more fun product,
right,
then absolutely. You want the rest of the provinces to be on the same page. That way, the profitability of the games isn't in flux based on where you're operating it. There's more consistency. But in terms of like pure casino products and sports betting products, I think Ontario's not going to need other provinces to jump on to be successful.
Interesting you mentioned pari-mutuel. Pari-mutuel is excluded from the definition of game in Ontario because pari-mutuel racing is regulated by a completely different federal regulator, the Canadian Pari-Mutuel Association. And the question in relation to the substance of that regulation, it's not even close to what Ontario has, not even close. But interestingly, there's never been a scandal in respect to that matter for years. And so you can go online and bet on a horse race, and you can do that right across Canada for all intents and purposes. And there's no issues from the perspective of integrity or honesty. It's being conducted in accordance with those standards of the federal government. Okay, we've got 1 minute and 10 seconds, now 9 seconds. Does anybody have any questions of our panelists? Any comments, suggestions, views, criticisms, whatever? Anybody? Gentlemen, any closing remarks?
I think it's great to finally have an iGaming conference in Toronto, both this one and your competitor. I think it's good for the market. I think it's good for the people. And hopefully next year they'll open these doors and it'll be the whole center.
Right.
I echo that. It's good to be back. I grew up here, and I've worked abroad through much of my career. And now that we have regulated infrastructure here, I'm happy that we can operate as part of it.
Yeah, I echo the same sentiments. It's great to be in Toronto. And thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to us today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, panelists. Audience, thank you very much for your apt attention. We'll see how the universe unfolds. Thank you.